Hello to those of you joining the calls. We're obviously just going to wait for a minute or so for people to dial in. Perhaps in the meantime, why don't you let us know where you are dialing in from today? And if you're up for it, maybe share a line or two about your thoughts on the relationship between well-being and performance in the workplace. Just pop them in the chat. So to those of you joining, I've just said to people, feel free to let us know where you are dialing in from today. And if you like, you could share a thought or two about your perspective on the relationship between well-being and performance in the workplace. We've got London, we've got Stockholm, Leeds, Brussels, nice multicultural audience, Manila. Okay, there's a whole bunch now. I can't read this quickly. This is great. Great to see a diverse audience dialing in. So we'll kick off in, I'm going to go, about a minute's time, 30 seconds time. Fellow South African. And Marcus, thanks for sharing your thoughts today. So a lack of well-being leads to increased staff turnover, increased absence, and a lack of motivation, which results in a lack of performance, I think. So definitely hinting at the relationship between the two, which we'll obviously get into more as we move through this webinar. So I'm gonna get started. Welcome everyone to this Unmind and CultureAmp webinar, how to boost performance through well-being. So my name's Steve Peralta. I'm the co-founder and Chief Wellbeing Officer at Unmind. And joining me today and bringing their valuable expertise and experience to this topic is Dr. Kati Adeseko, and I've said that wrong. And as I was about to say it, I'm sorry, Kati, did I say it wrong?
That's right.
Okay. Who's an applied positive psychologist at Unmind, and then Jessica Brannigan, a lead people scientist at CultureAmp. So Kati and Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Great. And thanks to everyone else who has taken this hour out of their day to join us for this chat. If you have any questions as this conversation progresses, then just pop them into the Q&A box and we will review them, and I will do my best to answer some of them towards the end of the webinar. But let's get into the conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Give me a second. Okay, so yeah, let's get into the conversation. So I guess to kick things off, I thought I'd set the scene by sharing just a few statistics to help give us a sense of where things are at in the world of workplace well-being at the moment. So a recent Deloitte report tells us that 43% of employees report always feeling exhausted at work. 42% of employees report always feeling stressed, and 90% of employees believe that their work life is getting worse. And the business impact of all of this is that we are losing $1 trillion worth of productivity each year across the globe due to poor mental health at work. That also means 12 billion days are lost to absenteeism caused by poor mental health. And so you can see there's a real impact here on businesses. Now, there are obviously a range of causes involved here. There are factors that are outside of our control, obviously things like the pandemic and the multi-crises and economic instability and the like. But I'd argue that there are also factors that are inside of our control. And to me, these are things like our beliefs about work, how we are choosing to work, how we are showing up at work, especially for a leader. And so I'm hoping that we can get some good insight today into how we can acknowledge and leverage the things that are inside of our control, whether we are a leader or a manager or an employee, so that I guess we can all play our part in co-creating workplaces where both people and the business can flourish. And I think our argument is perhaps that those two things go hand in hand. So this is a question to you both. Perhaps we'll start with yourself, Jessica. When we look at the rising rates of burnout and mental health problems, like I've just mentioned, in the workplace, it might suggest that for some organizations, and this is an assumption, but I'll put it to you, that pursuing achievement and results and employee well-being, or at least prioritizing employee well-being, are mutually exclusive endeavors, and that they are being traded off against one another. So, and I'm saying that based on the rising rates of burnout, right, and the market that we're in. So I guess, Jessica, starting with you, what are your thoughts on that statement? Are they mutually exclusive?
I think if you want my short answer, it's no, but I'll expand on that a little bit more. I definitely don't see them as mutually exclusive whatsoever, but rather well-being is something that is fundamental as a platform for sustained success over time. Like, I think you can play them off against each other if you just want productivity for the next week, but then don't expect it to carry on much longer than that. And in fact, studies have shown that there is a direct link between productivity levels and the general health and well-being of the workforce. So an Australian research group called Work on Wellbeing, or WOW short, reported in a study that workers became more productive at work to the tune of about $1,000 per year. Generally healthier, so sick days are cut in half, and that workers react more positively to workplace changes, all of which are things which contribute to productivity in essence. So and there's also lots of things around sort of organizational citizenship behaviors. When we feel well, when we feel happy, we're able to be helpful to our colleagues. We're able to be kind to our clients and to our customers. When we're not, it really undermines our ability to do our job effectively. So I think the mistake that organizations sometimes make is short-termism, basically, seeing this as a binary topic. Either we work hard or we have well-being, when actually well-being is key to enabling the hard work. And I also like to think about kind of sports analogies. Like, if you're running an elite sports team of whatever kind, you don't sign them up for back-to-back competitions with no rest and always rely on your two best players and never use anybody else. You have to work in rest and recovery time and switch them out in a sort of sensible fashion that enables them to optimize their performance and be at their best. And so why do we think about it differently in organizations? I don't know. So yeah, that would be my initial thoughts.
That's great. Yeah, I think you're speaking about the difference between, short-term focus on results versus sustainable high performance over time, and well-being has to play an integral part of that, right? And I think you mentioned short-termism. That also highlights another polarity here. There's a results well-being polarity, but then there's the short-term, long-term polarity too. And we need to be able to hold both of those. And to the degree that we just focus on results at the expense of well-being, we're going to experience long-term problems, right?
Absolutely. Individually and at the organizational level. Yeah.
Exactly. And Kati, anything to add on that?
I mean, you both just said it all. I absolutely agree with everything you said. They're definitely not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. And I think sometimes you spoke to so many good points, both of you, especially you, Jessica, what you said about them, why is it such a difficulty? Why do organizations not see it? And I guess sometimes it's a fear of the unknown, what it actually means to really invest into well-being. Is it just a tick box the company tries to tick? But I think once companies really understand and look at the science that is available and very much speaks to the importance of both organizational success and employee well-being being interdependent of each other, I think that's when they realize that sustainable high performance, mental health, well-being, all of those things become more sustainable. So it's also about acknowledging that it is only through a holistic approach, recognizing that these two are interdependent, that we're more likely to create a positive work environment that fosters all of those things that we need to be successful as a business, and also feel as an individual that we're achieving and accomplishing things, right? Mm-hmm. So innovation, long-term success, productivity, feeling motivated, all of those things go hand in hand. So absolutely agree.
Yeah, if we get this right, it's a win-win situation. You mentioned science there, Kati. So can you share, from your perspective, any compelling data, any compelling science as to why, rather than sacrificing well-being to achieve business objectives, we should rather embrace it as an essential, integral part of becoming a successful organization?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of compelling science in different areas within psychology and the work organizational psychology as well. But one that I always like to go back to is the World Health Organization, because they constantly report that good mental health in the workplace is associated with increased productivity, economic gains, and it really making it all a valuable investment for organizations, right, for both of those. And high job satisfaction, work engagement, both components of well-being, they're all associated with lower intentions to quit, decreased turnovers. I think somebody in the chat said that earlier as well about absenteeism. So I think on the flip side, we just need to remember as well that employees with poor well-being are more likely to have higher rates of absenteeism and turnovers as well. So that, of course, will lead to more costs for the organization. So sometimes organizations might think putting money into this seems quite a lot, but actually on the long run, they save so much more because they actually get the most out of their people. So yeah, I don't know if you, Jessica, I think you had a few specific science and stat numbers as well prepared, right, for this?
Yeah, we love a bit of data here at CultureAmp. So yeah, we've definitely got some research on that I'd be happy to share. So in our research, we are able to conduct that on kind of a huge data lake of employee kind of responses to all types of surveys, engagement surveys, well-being surveys, et cetera, et cetera. And when we looked at that data, we observed that well-being impacts both employee engagement and attrition. So when we look at responses to one of our key well-being items, which is, I rarely feel overstressed by my work, those who agree with that statement, i.e. they respond favorably, they're about 90% engaged, whilst those answering that question unfavorably, i.e. they do feel overstressed by their work, were only about 49% engaged. So that's a massive difference. Yeah. And thus you start to see how well-being and burnout can undermine engagement. And additionally, we then looked at employees who indicated that they were overstressed. And we looked at real attrition data, and what the real attrition data shows following that sentiment was that they were significantly more likely to leave within the next 12 months, which of course has impacts at both a kind of macro and a micro level. You know, if you think about just cost to hire, for example, it's often estimated to be about 6 to 9 months worth of salary for an individual. So even just looking at real financial costs and the loss of continuity, retained knowledge, and of course, let's not forget the impacts on kind of team morale, that all of those impacts can be really significant. And you know, it's really saying that it's a marathon, not a sprint. If you work 18-hour days to get things done, that's not going to be something that can be maintained. So we either need more resources or better prioritization to ensure that individuals can keep contributing meaningfully over the medium to longer term, unless you're happy with your business being successful for a week or a month, a year. Likely not. So we need to kind of think about things more holistically.
Yeah. So again, it's that longer term perspective, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's clear, and I'm sure we could rattle off a whole bunch of other, you know, studies, etc., that really back up this idea that well-being is essential for high performance. I mean, you even look at the group top 100 companies to work for. You compare their business results to the companies that aren't in that top 100 list, and they're far greater, right? And it's better revenue per employee, it's higher engagement, it's all those good things that we want from our people, right? And the things that drive those being a great company, it's trust in leadership, trust in knowing that leadership cares about my well-being. It's you know, stuff like work-life balance. It's all those things, right? There's a very real correlation between those things and business performance. And so there's this compelling argument for well-being in the workplace. And perhaps people know this now, right? But it can be difficult to know where to actually start. So let's say you know it's, okay, this is important for us, but where do I start? So Jessica, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So how can organizations actually tangibly, practically go about prioritizing and promoting mental health and well-being in their organization? So, you know, what are some of the key resources available to them? You know, this might be technology. It's obviously their people. You know, how can key resources best be leveraged by organizations to get this right?
Yeah, I agree. I feel like it's to use another exercise analogy. I feel like we all know that to be fit and healthy, we should be eating well and exercising, and then we don't do it. Like, why not? Because it's difficult, and change is difficult, and building in those behaviors and habits are difficult. And I think it's the same at an organizational level. Like, it can just be quite overwhelming. So a lot of organizations have really good intentions, and you'll see that in terms of, like, you know, policies or bits and pieces that people are kind of implementing in organizations. But really, you kind of think about where to start. And from our perspective, we think it's helpful to kind of start with data. So you want to ideally survey to understand what's going well in our organization when it comes to well-being, and to identify areas of improvement so that you can begin to understand what is most important to the well-being of your employees in your organization. And it probably will be quite unique. You'll have a different employee profile within one organization compared to another. So we can't assume everything will be the same, although there will be some underpinnings of course, you know, natural human functioning that all of us need to sort of not just survive, but thrive. And then we want to think about, once we've got that data, how do we build those key facets into our organizational strategy? So how do we get buy-in from senior leadership and enable managers to show up for their employees? So things like leaders role modeling critical behaviors is absolutely key, as is providing them necessary funding and backing to actually do this work. So I think there are often some pretty fundamental tactical pieces that will be important. When a message is being sent, for example, on email internally, how are expectations and prioritizations being communicated and revised and so forth? So, like, one tool that we use at CultureAmp is our one-to-ones pro forma, which is basically, obviously there's space to write in key agenda points, but we have these sliders that are about how are your work relationships right now? How is your well-being right now? And so those key prompts can really help the manager and the direct report to have a conversation at a slightly deeper level than just, did you do the report or didn't you? And if you didn't, let's not talk about the fact that it's because you know, your well-being was really struggling because of the amount of workload that we piled onto you. So anything you can do to give tools or nudges in the right direction for managers and leaders to start having the conversations that will make a difference, that's where I'd focus efforts. And you can start that journey by looking at data, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, you can't manage what you don't measure as well, right? You need to understand your company, to understand your workforce, understand what you're doing well, what you're not doing well. Otherwise, it's shooting in the dark.
Exactly. And you can even, you know, if you need to build a business case in your organization for this stuff to matter, some of the data and research that we've been citing has been done, you know, across organizations. But if you're collecting your own data, you can actually make linkage, so financial linkage between, hey, this is how people responded in our organization about well-being or engagement, and this is what happened in terms of attrition over the last year. Are we happy with that? Is that how we want to function? No. Okay, then we need to make changes and investments. And you know, by doing that, it makes a really strong business case for change to happen.
100%. As much as we should all want to create workplaces that elevate the lives of people in it just for the sake of that, right? I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, businesses are there to succeed. So when you can make that real strong link between employee well-being and actual business, you know, financial performance, then you really start to get into a conversation that I think, you know, senior leaders will be really interested in. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that those things go hand in hand. It's really important. You spoke about leadership there. So Kati, you know, at Unmind, we talk about the whole organization approach, right? Every person in the organization has a role to play in creating a mentally healthy organization. But Jessica, what you're focusing on there is the role that senior leaders play. And it's true that we all have a role to play, but senior leaders have an outsized influence, right? And therefore they also have an outsized opportunity when it comes to role modeling from the top and creating a culture of well-being. Having said that, we also know that research from Deloitte tells us that 91% of leaders believe that their employees know that they care about their well-being. But only 53% of employees agree with that. So there's a very real disconnect between leadership perception of how well they and the organization are doing when it comes to well-being and employee perception. And now, look, I don't think this comes down to leaders being terrible people. Of course not. It does speak to the fact, though, that leaders are either willingly or unwillingly sacrificing well-being to pursue results, to come back to what we spoke about earlier. Because I actually think we've just accepted or believed, and it's a false belief, that these are mutually exclusive endeavors. So given what you've both shared in terms of the science and the data, we know that this is flawed thinking. We know that well-being is integral to high performance. So Kati, how can leaders take advantage of their unique opportunity to really create positive impacts in their organizations? How can we help leaders to better create cultures that elevate the well-being of their employees, bearing in mind the tough market that we're in, which really makes life challenging for leaders?
I think you've highlighted such an important issue regarding the disconnect between the leader's perception of caring for employee well-being and then also the employee's actual experiences. And it's true that's also quite challenging for leaders sometimes, trying to balance, obviously, the pursuit of results, like you said yourself, and then prioritizing employee well-being. And I would also like to add here that it's not just down to the leaders, but we can get back to that later, I guess. But there are different strategies, and I think Jessica mentioned one of them already. So like leading by example, for example, demonstrating commitment to well-being through personal self-care and open discussions, clear boundaries within working hours. And also, I think, going back to creating a psychological safe environment. So even in order to get the results in these surveys to find out where the problems lie, we have to make employees feel comfortable enough to share this, right? So there has to be this element of accountability, you saying we're doing, and by building that trust, you actually establish a quite safe environment, so people are more willing to share. You're more willing, you know what to focus on, how to work, what to work with, and you can really then, fostering this open communication, and that will really help your strategies, right? Of course, there's different wellbeing initiatives people can put into place, and a lot of companies are doing that, but I think it really goes back to really creating that trust between the different levels. And I'm talking, again, like we do at Unmind as well, it's a whole organization. So it starts at organizational, leadership level, and employees. Everybody has a very important part to play.
100%. Jessica, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I could just maybe, I think I agree with all the points that have been made there. I guess I can give a specific example just to kind of bring it to life maybe a bit. Sure. But when we talk about like leaders demonstrating like through their behaviors, I can think of an example at CultureAmp. So here we're lucky enough that we have each quarter, the organization gets a day off, which we call refresh days. And it's useful rather than just added like sort of annual leave, because everybody else in the organization is off at the same time. It means you're not coming back to a load of work. What I found really helpful, and is maybe a more sort of a demonstrative example of leaders demonstrating this behavior, is seeing leaders in our organization having those days off, sharing photos or stories of the things that they did with their family, for example. It really sets the precedent that like, hey, it's not just like a nice idea that doesn't happen, like, and really you're expected to work, but you actually are supposed to use that day to relax and unwind and do something fun. And you actually, it's cool to talk about that and share what you did. If even your regional leaders are doing that, it makes it a lot more legitimate. And you could apply that type of same thinking to anything that you're kind of putting into place in your organization. You have to make people feel safe to use it, or that it's okay to use it, and show that it's being used at the most senior levels. And it's not just something that we're kind of putting on a slide and then we kind of just want you to work really on that day. Yeah. Exactly.
We have a value at Unmind called Be Human. And I think that's almost like a call to all leaders, right? I think being, or like embracing your humanity as a leader, being human, being vulnerable, opening up the conversation about these kinds of things, that can be so powerful within an organization, right? Because if I'm going to get into paradigms here, I almost feel that the paradigm that sacrifices well-being at the expense of just pursuit of results it's like a mechanistic paradigm where the organization is a machine with like inputs and outputs, and the employees are just cogs in that machine, right? Yeah. Then you've got this is the more accurate, I would say, you've got the understanding that it's not a machine, it's an ecosystem made up of human beings with human needs, which if met and honored and all the rest, helps them to flourish and perform at their best. And so like to the degree I'm not talking about disregarding the responsibilities of a leader, but it's that, and it's showing up in a human way. That starts to give permission to others to do the same. And then you start to create that culture where things like empathy and compassion and so on start to like naturally occur, because we are showing up as human beings first, right? And then like roles second. I think that can be really important in creating a culture of well-being.
I think that's such an important point, especially if you think about like, you know, a lot of developed economies now where, you know, the markets that they're operating in, they're like cognitive based, intelligence based, relationship based organizations. People who are not at their best, and that doesn't even mean not unwell, but not at their best and not going to thrive or deliver well in those types of roles, because what you're demanding of them is a lot of kind of, you know, emotional burden and, you know, an ability to deal with difficult relationships and stakeholders, to come up with innovative ideas. Like, you can't do that if you're not thriving. So I think it's such a valid point.
Sure.
Just to add to that as well, I think something that leadership and organizations can help with is by actually encouraging the employees to have that autonomy and involvement in those decision making when it comes to their job roles as well, because there's an element of job crafting, and there's loads of research around that as well, which refers to that intentional and proactive process of employees shaping and redesigning their job roles. And that very much then aligns to their skill set, their strengths, their passions. And with that, obviously, they'd be so much more motivated to give their role, and you actually get them thriving within their role. So that's a really important element. There are a few different things you can do. And I think organization, of course, we need to acknowledge we're talking about human beings. So every organization is different. Every individual is different. It's a process, but there are definitely different things that I think on each layer can be done.
Definitely. Yeah, this idea of human needs is so important. You've mentioned autonomy, you know, autonomy, fairness, respect, feeling valued, belonging, connection, a sense of like achievement. All those things are things that we all need as human beings. And if we can honor those, and we'll literally, you know, get the best out of people. So having said all this, like, there are probably many leaders that have the best of intentions when it comes to getting this right and supporting the well-being of their people. But we know that this is tough. This is really tough, and it's become probably increasingly tough. It feels like as a leader, there's just more things to hold. There's like increasing complexity and these competing needs and demands. So it's difficult, right? But Jessica, like, what would you think are some of the most common pitfalls that leaders encounter when trying to support employee well-being, or, you know, trying to implement well-being initiatives in their organizations? Based on your experience, what have you seen? Like, what are the most common challenges that leaders face?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because obviously we're working with a lot of organizations and seeing kind of real employee feedback. So you start to get a real feel for those things. And I would say the key pitfalls tend to be an over-reliance on a kind of off-the-shelf type solution, like, oh, we provide employee assistance programs, or we offer yoga classes or massages, for example. And it's not that, of course, it's not that those things are in any way bad per se, but they tend to have a kind of one and done, like tick box kind of phenomenon attached to them. But if the fundamentals are lacking in terms of folks being berated for not working out of hours, or staffing levels are falling woefully behind workload, or headaches with systems and processes are continually not being resolved, or actually something as simple as not really being clear on what's expected of you in your role, then you're not actually solving the underlying drivers which contribute to a lack of wellness. You're just treating the symptom, not the root cause. And so I guess if I was to share one of my medical analogies again, it would be like you're just taking painkillers every day for the sore tooth, because that's easy and immediate and it solves the problem for the next few hours, instead of booking the appointment with the dentist to get it properly checked out, having a course of treatment and changing the behavior in relation to, you know, in that example, toothbrushing, to make the changes that will really make a difference over time. You're just doing a quick fix. And so that's what I'd be encouraging organizations to do. And this is where, if you can give data to managers who manage teams, they can see really closely, both from employee feedback, but also from the work they're doing with their teams, what those sources of friction might be. Like, hey, I do think since we did that restructure, those folks really don't know, they're not clear on what we want from them, and that's stressing them out. Hey, actually, we really need to sort out this resourcing issue. The team have been overloaded now for too long and it's taking a toll on them. We need to resolve this both for them and for the organization. Those types of actions that are they seem quite fundamental, but they're often the issues that are going unresolved and contributing to a lack of well-being over time.
100%. Anything to add to that, Kati?
No, I think she said it very much. And I would just say it really comes back to creating that culture, you know, where it's like changing the language around things, right? So it doesn't become like well-being washing, which we've been hearing a lot as well at the moment. And it's just jarring sometimes for people to hear, go and take care of yourself and, you know, self-care and all of those things. And you just think, okay, and it becomes another chore. So I really like the analogies there. And it's not about quick fixes. It's about really changing a narrative, changing our languages around it, changing a culture within an organization that everybody follows. And also, I think you mentioned that very much at the beginning, how important it is to be there for each other. So to have that community at work as well, where you kind of support each other, doing exactly following the same, you know, like with a family, you have your morals and your values and you follow that as a family, and everybody still has their own personality and their own things. And I think it's the same within an organization. You all have your own, we need to be inclusive and you know, very much take that into account. But at the same time, if we as an organization have certain values that we're following, then that's the kind of the way we can actually move forward without thinking it's just another tick box thing.
For sure. So it needs to be authentic and across
Exactly.
the organization. We've been focusing on leaders and we've mentioned managers. They obviously play a really important role. And we know managers play a really important role. I think there's a recent study that showed they have more influence on a person's well-being than their therapist does. So, you know, there's a important role to play there, which speaks to the importance of empowering, supporting, upskilling, training managers to be able to create healthy cultures within their team. So really important. But we know it's not just down to leaders and managers, right? So, you know, we do all have a role to play when it comes to culture, when it comes to co-creating workplace cultures that support each other, that elevate well-being. So Kati, like from that perspective, what steps or what things can employees do to obviously better support their own mental health and well-being at work, and also be a positive force for those people around them?
I'm going to say it now. It is starting with self-care, because it does start with ourselves. We can't pour from an empty cup. We hear it all the time. So it is just, and as an individual, we just need to always focus on the things that are within our control. And that is one of them. And it starts there. So it's about taking responsibility for our own well-being by practicing these self-care strategies, right? That is just very basic things like enough sleep, maintaining a balanced diet, engaging regular physical activity, and really prioritizing, relaxing, recharging, having these clear boundaries at work. And again, I guess that also comes with, you know, within your rights, I guess, as an employee, to just really live and promote a work-life balance, to have these healthy boundaries in place. It's also about building positive and more supportive relationships with your colleagues, right? So I think going back to that element of empathy and compassion you mentioned earlier, Steve, it's so important to offer a listening ear sometimes, that willingness to help each other, speaking up when something is wrong, right? So, and I guess also educating ourselves about mental health and how we can support each other, looking for signs of stress or burnout or other mental health concerns and challenges that are quite, you know, prevalent within a workplace as well. And it can be, of course, from other reasons, not just work, but yeah, those things I think are really important. So yeah, I guess, yeah, taking control of the things that we can do for ourselves and also for our colleagues within the remit that doesn't drain us. So I guess, yeah, encouraging these implementations of wellbeing initiatives, both in your workplace from your individual perspective, but also to encourage others to do that. I think it's so important. We all have that. We all have a responsibility. So
yeah, for sure. For sure. Thank you, Kati. Jessica, anything to add to that before we start to open up some audience questions?
Yeah, I love the focus that Kati has on like for the individuals to focus on what they can control for, because, you know, oftentimes when we hear like, oh, different layers and individuals should kind of take control of this for themselves. It's not to say that the action should start and end with them, but you play your part, and then the organization needs to play their part, and it only kind of all works if we're all playing our individual roles. So I really like that focus on control. But I definitely think the setting boundaries piece is an interesting one. I've certainly seen in like hyper growth companies, so particularly startups and scale ups, they often attract a certain type of person who might be, you know, highly driven, perhaps in terms of their way of working. We often end up with quite a lot of perfectionists in certain types of environments. And so I think at the individual level, what you can often see is actually engagement goes up, but it starts to undermine their well-being. So it might be good for the organization, and that's where the setting boundaries piece becomes really important for people to learn as they move through their career, because they need to learn as an individual, how far can I push myself before this is not healthy for me or the organization. And so I do think there's really an art and a skill to be learned there around the setting boundaries piece that Kati mentioned.
Definitely. There's something interesting to mention there. You mentioned engagement and well-being. I think I read some Gallup research which stated that it used to be that well-being and engagement rose together, but then during the pandemic, an interesting happened where engagement increased, but well-being sort of decreased. So for the first time, they became like inversely correlated, which was very strange. I think it probably just speaks to overwork, right? I think it became a really intense period, which we seem to just be carrying over. And there's an invitation here to like step back and re-examine our ways of working at the moment. And hopefully we get that healthy correlation again between engagement and well-being. I thought it was an interesting shift that happened.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dichotomy, and we often get questions around that from customers. And I think it's just, important to kind of reset that and know where the boundaries are for the individual and for the organization, because essentially it's kind of a symptom of what we were talking about in terms of that we can't just keep pushing it in terms of performance, because at some point it's going to start to undermine us, and that's what you see play out in the data, really.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between, real high performance and sustainable high performance, So
Yeah.
it speaks to that.
Okay, we're going to, sorry, Kati.
Oh, no.
There's been loads of questions coming through, so I'd like to get some of those now. There are loads, but so there's two here which I think relate to each other. So I'm going to read them both and then ask you, either of you or both of you, to share your thoughts on it. So the first question is, who should own well-being initiatives? So should that be like the organization? Should it be teams? Who should own them? Then there's a related question. It's now disappeared. So it was there. Anyway, let's answer that one. Who should own well-being initiatives?
I don't mind jumping in there. So I think that's always an interesting question, and we get similar questions for other facets of like employee experience in terms of engagement and things like that. And I think the sort of main thrust of my answer will be everyone should take responsibility for it, both employees, both managers, both leaders, and the organization. However, does that mean we can just sort of say, oh, everyone's responsible for it, and then no one really does anything? No, which is where I think organizations that are of sufficient size and have sufficient resources, where they can have folks who can look at these topics. So if you, for example, we're talking about, getting data and employee feedback on these topics, someone needs to drive that and make it happen and analyze it and then take action off the back of it and motivate the organization to take action off the back of it. So I think it's where you can, it's great to have roles that focus on it, but it doesn't mean that person, if it's one person, is responsible for it. They're responsible for trying to drive change. It's essentially a change program. And they can do that best where they have senior leadership sponsoring those types of programs, both, emotionally, but also financially. Like if you just hire a person and then give them little to no resources, you're setting them up for failure. But if you give them the opportunity, you give them the sponsorship, you give them the resources, then they can go out and support managers, leaders, and individual employees to take their part, as we were kind of mentioning earlier. That's my perspective. I don't know if you have anything else to add there, Kati.
Yeah, really just what you said. I think everybody obviously again plays a huge role, but it has to start at the top. So if there's no point saying we want wellbeing champions and all of those things, but they're not making time within work hours for those things. So the organization, the higher levels, senior executive levels, they need to kind of, like you said, put the resources into place, empower employees to do that. And then of course, responsibilities need to be taken. There need to be other roles. We had a lovely wellbeing champion course that we shared freely for everybody and to use, and it's things like that. But it is definitely a cumulative responsibility, but we have to kind of lay the foundation that people are empowered and able to do that and take those roles on.
Thank you both. So I found the question that related. You may feel that you've answered the question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because there might be some additional things you want to add. This focuses more in on actual sort of well-being leads or managers within an organization. So the question is, I completely agree with your comments on needing to address the root cause. This is the case in my organization where unresolved issues that contribute to high stress and burnout, such as processes and systems and under-resourced teams. But we often don't talk about where the responsibility of the well-being professionals start and end. So the question is, how do you see the role of well-being managers in the prevention piece in addressing root cause? Is our role to use data to present the business case to leadership? So that's the question. Otherwise, well-being is only a band-aid over bigger issues that are not being resolved. So what is the role of well-being leads, well-being managers within an organization, particularly around the prevention piece? So I think it does add a bit more nuance to the previous question. So I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I love the question. I think there's a lot of like deep thinking behind that question there. I guess in line with my previous answer, what I would say in terms of like those roles would be if they could think of themselves as change agents. So it's your role to make the case, it's your role to push for what you think will make the most difference based on your detailed analysis of what's happening in the organization. And it's your role to sort of try to get the resources that would make the changes necessary. And so, yeah, I think if I was in a role like that, I would see myself as a change agent. And to that extent, you can try and prompt and encourage. Can you do it on your own? Absolutely not.
I like that. Change agent's a good term. Kati, anything to share?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very interesting question. And I think, we talk a lot about prevention is better than cure. But again, because we're working with individuals and everybody is in a very different level on their mental health and well-being journey, I think it will be difficult. So I think as much as it's important to have those preventative initiatives in place, so for people that maybe are at that journey, they can benefit from it, and then also be very aware and build that safe place for people that maybe might need other support. And we talk about Unmind Talk, for example, or EAPs and things like that, where people get a little bit more personalized support. So I think it's about just having a little bit of a platform for different levels, and maybe also just acknowledging the fact that everybody is on a very different at a very different stage on there. Mental health is such a continuum, so I think it's just really important to be mindful of that.
Thanks, Kati. So there's been quite a few questions that have come through around time. So I'll fuse it into one question. So it seems to be that people are recognizing that employees often don't have time for well-being initiatives. So what can organizations do to make sure that employees are able to actually take time to nurture their well-being? So I'd love to hear any thoughts based on things that might have worked in the past, but just, your thoughts on that.
I think it's about, again, going back to changing the narrative and the culture as a company, right? So you need to have the values that very much clearly communicate the importance and benefits of well-being, and also initiatives to the employees. It's about normalizing well-being breaks, for example, incorporating them within the day, right? And then also it's very important for leaders and again, managers, etc., to put those in the diary and lead by example. So it's okay to do that. It's about prioritizing and delegating to make that more okay, whether it's in one-to-ones or in team meetings, to help each other, support each other, draw from each other's strengths. And I think again it's the responsibility from higher up, but also within ourselves to kind of lead that helping hand and support each other, make it okay to ask for help and delegate example, all of those things. And again, I guess it's organizational level as well, about integrating wellbeing initiatives into work days, or having flexible options around work, and making sure your employees have everything they need to be efficient. And things like, sorry, it's just such a, you can go on and on about it. So I'm just mindful if you want to add anything, Jessica.
I think I would definitely, in terms of time, I would definitely come back to the prioritization topic. I was looking at something last week that someone shared with me, which was the Eisenhower matrix, which is where you classify topics into, like, it's a classic 2x2, which is like how important is a task and how urgent is the task, and then important urgent things, do them now. Important less urgent things, schedule them for later. Others you might want to delegate, and then there's a box that you actually like should just scrap and get rid of. And now, interestingly, this is where it starts to kind of bleed into psychological safety in an environment. And this is where culture is so important. If you want a culture of well-being, how you manage and sort of liaise with your employees and your teams on boundaries, I think is really important, because to use something like the Eisenhower matrix effectively in terms of prioritizing, like, hey, this work isn't important, it isn't urgent, so I'm not going to do that anymore. That does require a certain degree of autonomy, and it does require an organization and managers and leaders who will embrace those types of conversations. And that's what you really need in the world of work today, because you will always have too many pieces of work on your plate. And what you really need is the ability for the manager and the employee to have a dialogue about that and reach a conclusion on, like, yeah, these are the important things. Let's put those other things on the back burner for now. That ability to prioritize is kind of the only way, I think, to solve some of those time-bound issues.
We use the analogy at Unmind of porcelain and plastic plates, right? So which plastic plates can you drop and nothing will happen, but which porcelain plates do you have to kind of carry? So I think in that model that you talk to as well with important and urgent, I think it's really, and sometimes it's so easy to think everything is urgent and I need to keep myself. So again, I guess it's that element of also, you know, the work that you can do for yourself in terms of perfection and having to constantly perform. But again, it also starts from the top to kind of empower individuals to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think you see some of the best managers having that dialogue with their employees about, like, good enough is good enough. Not everything has to be outstanding. And we have our sort of global director of people science, he uses a nice phrase all the time around, like, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And there is often that paralyzing effect of, like, continuing to always make things perfect just means you don't get things done, and then actually it just makes you more stressed and burnt out over time. Sometimes there has to be a bit of a dialogue around, what standards are we aiming for? What's good enough here? Let's get to that and move on. So yeah, but there's a lot of skill behind that.
Thanks both. I think wellbeing initiatives are fantastic. Obviously, I think the key thing to, and this will take time, but the key thing to recognize is that it is the culture and the ways of working and the way leaders are showing up and how managers interact. That's really the highest leverage points for truly elevating mental health and wellbeing within the organization. Like, we know that the key drivers of poor mental health and well-being are things like workload and a mismatch between demands and resources and manager relationships and all the like. So, like, that's really where the highest leverage is for organizations. But it's not an easy fix, right? But it's important to recognize that.
And I think just sort of riffing off that point, some of the sort of, I think, organizational factors, or like sometimes seen as hygiene factors, things around setting goals and having regular reviews can be really helpful, actually, in terms of, you know, what's expected of you, and then we're continually checking in on whether that's happening or not, can really help people psychologically to know and assess in their own mind what's good enough, what's being expected of me. I think in the absence of having those things, that's where people fill the absence with worry and concern, which is unhelpful for the individual and the manager usually.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question. Perhaps Jessica, it's for you, but let's see. So how would you structure a well-being survey to ensure proactive idea generation and suggestions, rather than it descending into a space to air any complaints that might not be productive? A follow-on question: do you agree with mandatory surveys, as self-selecting tends to attract staff who already care about well-being or are very vocal about issues? So obviously, you know, surveys is one of the key essential things at CultureAmp. What's your philosophy around this?
Yeah, surveys is definitely our thing, so I can definitely speak to those. So in terms of the right questions to ask, we have a wellbeing template at CultureAmp, and we do have support guide articles and things. So we're pretty free with you know, our approach and the science behind the templates and the questions that we ask. So you can use that as a good starting point, whether you're a CultureAmp customer or not. But primarily what we tend to use is we use a number of questions that measure well-being. So it tells you, how good is well-being here? And then we have a range of other questions that are the things that would moderate how successful you might be at that or not. So for example, workload or time out or, emotional support, those sorts of things would be the things that would moderate what that score would be. So that's just a little bit about design. And some of the considerations we have in relation to design are always about pragmatic questions. So for the driver set of questions that might influence the outcome, they have to be such that if the score is low, you would be able to action on it. So that's our kind of key criteria in terms of question design. So often you'll see folks who are interested in this space, they want to ask questions, but when you look at it, you need to say, if that question has a low score, does it feel like something we can take action on? And if not, perhaps it's just more general research than it is a survey for sort of actionable purposes. And then speaking to the second point, which is around, should surveys be, required of everybody, or should they be optional? Typically, our approach is to make surveys optional, and depending on the size of your organization, we'd be looking for different responding rates. Typically, you want a participation rate that's sufficient, that you minimize kind of error just based on like a too small a sample. So if you have a small population under 1,000, we'd be looking for about 80% ideally, and then for larger organizations, about 65%. And I think where possible, not forcing folks to take part. The reason being, if you have a very unsafe organization, you're often just kind of coercing people. So generally inviting them to take part would be our preference.
One of the key things you mentioned there, and there was a question that referenced this around like disengagement in surveys, like survey fatigue, etc. I think that the research shows that it's more like inaction fatigue. In other words, we're doing these surveys, the organization never takes any action off the back of them. So I think that's the really important bit here is to ask questions that you can then take action off the back of, and your employees need to see that you are hearing them and taking action. That can then most likely lead to more engagement in surveys, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. People get lack of action fatigue, not survey fatigue. But yeah, or, you can think carefully about how long is it going to take us to move the needle on this, and not just kind of feel the need to keep collecting data, which I think often people feel like shows that you care, and it does to a certain extent, but not as much as doing it in a sort of really well thought through way and thinking about the right cadence for you to collect research data and then to action and move the needle before you kind of ask again.
For sure. Okay, great. Thanks for sending through your questions. I'd like to leave some time at the end now to ask you both a few more final questions to start to wrap this up. So, Kati, I'll ask you first. I'd like us to project forward into the future about 5 or 10 years and imagine that all of us as organizations have got this right, and we have co-created workplaces where people are really able to flourish. Workplaces that enhance well-being and performance. So just tell me in a few sentences, what does this look and feel like to be working in such an organization in the future?
I actually don't think saying fulfilled would be an exaggeration here, given that we spent such a significant amount of time working in our lives. So I guess in a future where workplaces have successfully prioritized well-being and created environments that kind of foster both the flourishing and a high performance element, working in such organizations would be characterized by all the things that we spoke about today. So really establishing a positive and supportive culture, building on a foundation of trust here, respect, empathy, where colleagues and leaders would genuinely care about each other and their well-being, and creating that psychological safe environment really for people to do share. And that comes back to you saying we're doing, and like building that trust element. So I guess flexible, balanced work arrangements where kind of work-life balance will be highly valued and actively supported, where people are looking at the job demand and resources relationship, where organization will prioritize holistic well-being, recognizing that it comes from all levels and that mental, emotional, and physical well-being are all interconnected. I think it's about having clear understanding of how their work contributes to the organization mission and purpose. We all, as human beings, we need to be motivated. We need to feel like we accomplish things. So it does come back to that element of flexibility, autonomy, and being able to kind of work to our strengths as well. There's a lot more points, but I'm going to stick to the few sentences.
Sounds like a good future. Yourself, Jessica, what does this ideal workplace look like in the future? I think it's good to have this kind of aspiration, right? It can inform some of the decisions we make today. So I'd love to hear.
Yeah, kind of a North Star that we're heading towards. Yeah. I think it looks like real flexibility according to different individual needs for flourishing, like with less rules and bureaucracy and more empowerment of managers and local leadership to make people first decisions, because they know that doing so in the near term promotes business success in the longer term. But moreover, I think we'll start to see more and more external pressure on organizations from the likes of shareholders, customers, and even governments to demonstrate how organizations are proactively thinking about the well-being of their workforce. So I think that will force a lot more progress, optimistically.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. We've covered a lot of great stuff that I think people can work with, but let's just finish with a few recommendations that people can sort of take away from here, that you might want to leave them something tangible that people can action straight away. So this might be for leaders, it might be for managers, for employees, you can choose, but what is one key actionable invitation that you leave the audience with today? So Kati, I'll ask you first.
Okay, for all different levels, you mean? For
your one big key takeaway action invitation for people.
Realize that it's a communal action, it's a process, and we all need to play our parts, take responsibility, and move this thing forward so we all win.
I love it. Yeah, take responsibility, all of us, regardless of whether you're a leader, a manager, or an employee. I think it's important. Thank you. Jessica.
I would say for anyone, whether it's the organization, the leaders or managers, building healthy habits is the way forward. Look at how you're approaching things, look at the things that you're doing weeks, months, years into your role, and think about what's the right healthy habit here to drive the right behavior for me, for my team, for my part of the organization.
I like that. Fantastic. Okay, well, brilliant. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen quickly as we start to wrap things up. There we are. So feel free to use these QR codes to learn more about CultureAmp, to learn more about Unmind. So I'm going to thank you, Dr. Kati and Jessica. I've loved hearing your perspectives, your thoughts, your actionable advice, your blending of humanity and science. It's all been really fantastic. I think the message is clear, right? Well-being and high performance are not mutually exclusive. They, in fact, employee well-being is an essential ingredient in becoming, a high-performing individual, a team, and an organization. And with the right intention, first of all, you have to have the intention, the right intention, and then strategy. You can create a workplace culture and an environment where both the employee and the business can flourish. So I hope all of you on the call today walk away from this webinar with at least one thing that you want to try in your own workplace. I want to thank you all for joining us, for taking this hour out of your day to be with us. I hope you have a good rest of your week and weekend ahead. And that's it. So thank you and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
So
Bye-bye.
Bye.